A last-ditch offensive by Germany to try to save the war, and a secret assassination squad sent by Hitler on a mission to kill Eisenhower that might have changed the outcome of World War II and world history. Today, Mark Frost is back. His new book is The Second Objective. He's a TV and movie producer and author of several bestsellers. Great to have you back again today, Mark.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Well, since you're a movie producer, I'll say that this has a movie written all over it. Indeed, just the plot sounds like it's straight out of a movie, but it's a true event based on a little-known incident during the Battle of the Bulge.
That's correct. I found some research leading to this when I was researching another book, and could not believe that no one had ever written about this fully.
Yeah.
That Hitler had actually commissioned a brigade of English-speaking German soldiers, trained them in top secret in a camp in Bavaria, and sent them in dressed as Americans in American vehicles with weapons. And
there were, what, about 2,000 of them?
There were 2,000 of them that drawn from all over the Third Reich. And this was the dying days of the Third Reich. It was toward the end of the war, and it was a desperate attempt on his part to try to gain some leverage to fight the Russians on the East Front.
What do you think of the battle itself? Was it a wise... You know, I mean, is it a kind of a Napoleonic thing where at the last minute when you should be on the retreat, you go on the offensive, or was it just foolhardy to begin with?
Well, I mean, we could say that everything he did was foolhardy, but this was an attempt to try to land a roundhouse right when you're lying on the canvas. The Allies were not expecting an offensive. They thought they had Germany beaten. They'd beaten them back to their borders. And he suddenly was able to assemble the largest landmass force in the whole history of the war, and
it was
struck
what, 500,000?
There were 500,000 Germans, and he'd assembled them virtually without detection along this front, along Belgium and Luxembourg, and he struck without warning. And it caused immense chaos behind Allied lines. And one of the contributing factors was the discovery that there were about 250 Americans, dressed as Americans, running around possibly trying to kill Eisenhower. So it was pretty effective.
Now, in the book, you explain the details of this, and I'm curious how much is true and how much you fictionalized because either the details weren't known. How did they get the Americans?
Well, these were all actually Germans who spoke English that he pulled from throughout his army, and they were brought to this camp basically against their will and trained whether they wanted to be there or not. And details of this were covered up by military intelligence for about 50 years. They only started to come out in the last 10 years. So if the battle around this had been better organized, this plot might have worked. As it turned out, it still caused a lot of trouble for the Allies.
The reason I was asking where he got them from, because in the book, the main character, Bernie, grew up in New York until his family moved to Germany in his teens, and I just wondered if it was that kind of a thing where...
Yes. Yeah, there were, as I researched the actual group, there were at least 10 men in the larger group who had been born in America, and for whatever reason had ended up in Germany. A couple had been deserters, a few had been teenagers when they'd moved back to Germany. Germany had made a big attempt to repatriate German technicians and scientists. And in America during the Depression, a lot of them lost their jobs. So they were tempted to come back to the fatherland. And this was part of his plot, really, to build the war machine for Germany. And so, yeah, one of our lead characters is the son of one of those families who ends up back in Germany.
And those people may not have realized, of course, or probably didn't realize what they were getting themselves into.
Well, there was
initially.
No, it kept totally secret. Their objectives weren't known to any but really very few in the group. And not until the night before the invasion, when they went across, there was a smaller group within the larger group who were given this secret objective, the second objective, of going after Eisenhower at Versailles, and none of them were told about any of this virtually till the night before they went across the border.
Right, and that's where your title came from, The Second Objective.
Right.
And the interesting thing about that, when I was reading it, I was thinking, I think a comment you made later, or a comparison, was to modern terrorism. And it's that kind of a thing where, they're behind the enemy lines, dressed as the other side, and kind of sneaking in, doing the damage, the kind of things that people do today.
Yeah, there had been this kind of, at least in the European theater, there was still an odd sort of bow to good manners in warcraft, that you wore your own uniform, you didn't kill prisoners of war, the Geneva Convention was in place. And between Germany and England, at least, there hadn't been a lot of really blatant atrocities. In this latter stage of the war, the rules were kind of thrown out the window. And
if you needed, it was for survival, probably, at least in Hitler's opinion. So.
Yeah, then you needed to pull out all the stops. And this was one of them. And the man he put in charge of this mission was his head commando, a man named Otto Skorzeny, who was a notorious commando who had been the guy who'd rescued Mussolini from captivity in Italy.
What was his title? Was what, like, or
he was a lieutenant colonel in the SS.
Or I'm sorry, his sort of nickname, or he became known as what, like what was it, the evilest man in Europe? Or
he was thought of as the most dangerous man alive
yeah.
by many people, because he was kind of fearless and in many ways a great soldier, but he was also a completely amoral sociopath. So he had that going for him.
I guess it helps when you're on Hitler's team.
When you're on Hitler's team, it was good to play by those rules. Yeah.
But yet, but apparently, though, both sides did dress up as the other.
Well, you know, the formation of this, what was the SAS on the Secret Service on the English side, started at about the same time that these commandos on the German side did, and they were both doing missions in each other's uniforms during this final year of the war. So that was actually the technicality that got Skorzeny off a war crime trial after the war was over. He said, well, but everybody was doing it, so I wasn't breaking rules that other people weren't obeying. No one had ever put people in the other team's uniforms to commit assassinations before, however. And
that's what I wondered.
That really changed the rules. And in this, and in what Skorzeny did afterward, is really the birth of modern terrorism as we know it now. I mean, this was war by a different means than what we had seen before.
Now, again, in the book, you go into a lot of detail and carry it to a certain point. Based on your research, did it really get that far in reality, or what do we know about how far it actually got?
What we know is that in this group that were chosen for the second objective, who were the ones who were most fluent in English and had the ability to speak slang and really pass as Americans without flaws, there were about 20 of them who were sent in these four-man teams. 18 of these men were captured and executed within 4 or 5 days, once the first one was captured and confessed. And
because, by the way, if you were wearing the other side's uniform, then you got shot.
You could be shot on sight. I mean, that was the sort of standing rule. And all 18 of these men were executed, and but after brief court-martials. 2 of them were never accounted for. So my idea with the book was to let's follow the story of 2 who might have been the 2 that we didn't hear about.
I see.
And where do they take us, and how close did they get? And there are indications in certain documents that something happened at Versailles that means they got pretty close. So that was where I was going with it.
Because Eisenhower's security was increased quite a bit, was that one of the things that...
Well, this was maybe the most damage that they actually did to the Allies. When word got out that these guys were on the loose, suddenly everybody in an American uniform was a suspect.
Yeah.
And this huge network of checkpoints were thrown up, and things kind of came to a stop at the same time that the most dangerous offensive of the war had begun on the German side. So it really clogged up the back lines.
Right.
There were stories of generals being stopped and held for hours at a time.
I think Bradley and
Montgomery on the British side, because they didn't know the proper password, or they didn't know, you know, this is where all these stories about who was playing second base for the Chicago Cubs in 1937. All these military policemen were suddenly taking it upon themselves to really increase the security and ask more and more difficult questions to answer.
The problem was not all of them knew their facts, though, either, right?
There were a few who were asking the wrong question, or thought they had the wrong answer, and things got kind of
As a former Chicagoan, I enjoyed the officers who were grilling the general and some of the other soldiers on what was the capital of Illinois.
Right, they got that wrong. A lot of these were drawn from real incidents. I mean, there was real panic that these guys were on the loose, and they were very dangerous men for the most part. They were spies in American uniforms with license and ability to kill.
Now, you said the 2 that you wrote about were the ones that there wasn't as much information about? Or?
They're based in part on composites of characters that I found. There was, in fact, as I mentioned, a group of Americans who had been born in America and had, for whatever reason, ended up back in Germany, who ended up in German uniforms. And there was one in particular who was in a German diplomatic family who had been attached to the London embassy and had grown up basically as an Englishman, who became an officer in the SS and was in fact a member of this outfit. So drawing on that as a background, I then weaved a character around those facts and took it from there. And he's, you know, virtually our most important villain in the story.
Yeah, and I was wondering, because since he was British and if they were going to pass for American, but I guess he was teaching them American slang.
Well, that was why they were in this camp for 6 weeks. This guy had to learn the American accent, and we've heard English actors, learn to speak American, and the way they hit the hard R, and it's possible to pick these things up, and he was trained extremely well and took it very seriously.
That led to some interesting comments though about that. So you had the Germans who were trained in England, then fighting so they could thank, Cambridge or something, or the
right. Well, for me, one of the themes of the book was to discover this idea of identity. It's like, when you put on a uniform, you're normally assumed to be taking the role of a soldier in that army. But so what if you're a born American who's been sent back to Germany, who's now a German soldier, who's being asked to pose as an American soldier? I mean, that's a real dilemma for a character's identity and his self-image of himself. Same with a guy, born in Germany but grown up in England, and suddenly he's asked to do the same thing. I felt it was an interesting thing to examine.
We'll be right back with Mark Frost right after this. And we are back with Mark Frost, author of The Second Objective, today talking about incident of World War II. We were talking about identity and loyalty before the break. You seem to suggest that the Americans, remained loyal or had some kind of loyalty to America. Do you think that was true based on your research about the other Americans who had moved to Germany or were
with the few exceptions of those who had actually deserted during the war, who were, for whatever reason, totally embittered about the American military, and a somewhat tragic story. I mean, these guys were caught and executed, and the whole time professing, that they were Americans. So there's a real bitterness
because the one
to
character left America as a teenager for Germany and then joined the war later, but the other guy actually deserted the American army as an American soldier and went to the other side, and then he was caught. And that was true.
That's a true story, and he was executed. And
do you know how big of a problem desertion was by American soldiers?
It was quite extreme. I mean, once they'd landed in, the war really changed once they got ashore in France. All the rules were different, and once Paris was taken, and one of the things we talk about in the book is the flourishing black market that sprung up.
That amazed me. I'd never heard it about. Maybe other people know about it, but I didn't know about it at all. And again, I hate to say it, but it's sort of like the unfortunate or kind of the lower side, not just of war, but of people. Because you think here they are fighting for survival, and the SOBs are out selling. Or, they selling out their own country.
They were selling out their own country. There was in fact, this is based in part on an entire railway battalion. Was involved in schemes to steal goods that were on trains going to GIs stationed throughout the war zone, and then stealing them and selling them to people in the black market, where they would go to both Americans, Germans, French, whoever was willing to pay.
Wow.
But
so money rules.
Money rules. I mean, what happens? The rules of civilization go out the window in war. That's the first casualty of war, and
especially if you can make a buck off of it.
If you can make a buck off it, and Americans are nothing if not ingenious, and
indeed,
a good number of them, in the hundreds, were involved in these efforts to move and steal and move contraband.
Now, you said at one point it was either 40% of the stuff practically did or didn't make it there. I forget
didn't
which
make
way.
it there.
Didn't make it there.
There were that many people operating who had criminal intent, and they had these trains moving, obviously, from Normandy and the other landing points eastward into the heartland where the GIs were stationed, and very few of them made it intact with all the things that they were supposed to be bringing them.
Was the military police officer who tracked these guys down in the book, was that based on a real person?
He was based in part on a composite of a couple of characters, and one in particular who worked on this railway battalion case. I mean, they arrested about virtually an entire battalion who had been taking down these trains, and I found a man who had been in charge of that operation, who I thought was a fascinating guy to base a character on. What do you do as a policeman? And this guy was a NYPD homicide cop before he was recruited into the military police. As they pulled homicide cops and other big city cops from around the country to man this force. It was called the Criminal Investigation Division as part of the military police, and they were there to investigate crimes committed by GIs against GIs. So the irony is, what happens when you put a cop in the middle of a war who's trying to solve a murder, when in fact that's what everybody's there to do.
Yeah,
they're there to
kill. But yet
he
had better, let's say, I don't say technique, or he could rely on those methods, though, that the soldiers might be used to shooting people or defending themselves, but they didn't have that detective work kind of background that he was able to bring to.
Yeah, and nor were the military police trained in that. They were there, for crowd control and traffic flow, and they didn't have this real forensic kind of experience that this cadre of officers who came over did have. And I thought it was a fascinating angle to look at this part of the American experience of the war, of these experienced police officers who were suddenly thrust into having to act like policemen again,
Sure.
when you know, all around you is wanton destruction. It was an interesting dilemma.
Well, you seem to imply in the book that well, this was not good PR. I mean, at this point, you know, the war was going fairly well, or, you know, toward the end,
Yeah.
and were they trying to hush it up because
Sure.
they didn't want parents at home to know their little kids were, you know,
There was a, yeah.
they're proud they're sending off in the war, not knowing he's out robbing trains and selling goods to the enemy.
That was something they tried to keep under wraps. They kept, in fact, the whole episode of the court martials around this case were classified for 50 years. I mean, this was not. There's a very brief mention of it as you track the story in Stars and Stripes magazine, which was the daily paper for the average GI. And no facts at all made it back into the press at home. They did impose a blackout on these trials, so it was a kind of a disgraceful episode, and they didn't want it influencing the opinions of people back home.
Another kind of, I don't know, interesting tidbit from history that I got out of this that I was not aware of was that that in Paris, after the Allies had liberated Paris, and there were a lot of murders in Paris.
Yeah,
a lot of retribution.
Yeah, this is a city that, you know, had been taken over by the Germans in the late 30s, and the bitterness of the French who had decided to collaborate with the Germans and stay in Paris as opposed to fleeing or going to Vichy France. When the town changed hands again, there was a lot of payback that came back the other way. And as the French police and the military police from the Allies started to take control of the city again, a lot of blind eyes were turned to people settling scores. There were hundreds of murders during that time. And for this period of, say, August to December in 1944, it was a fairly lawless place to be. I thought that was an interesting thing to cover as well.
Yeah, because of course you wonder if if it was purely political or if they were just settling other scores, and all you had to do was say so and so helped the Germans, and then somebody go do them, you know.
Exactly right. Well, I mean, this is you see the worst of humanity when they're exposed to these kind of stresses, and it was there in spades in fall and winter of '44.
But another interesting thing about this episode, but I was thinking, you know, again, in the scale of, okay, today we have terrorism,
Yeah.
but yet when you're fighting something on the scale of World War II with, what, hundreds of thousands or what, perhaps millions of soldiers in total on all the sides, a lot of countries, you know, just the logistics of trying to know who was whom, and, you know, once they started to get paranoid about people sneaking behind the enemy lines, I thought, you know, it's a really interesting question of how out in the field, especially with the technology not being what it is today, and of course even today it can be a problem, but just, it's an interesting problem how on the battlefield, how you really know
who's who.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when you see how people behaved in this instance, it lays that wide open. I mean, there had been no reason to doubt the person who was to your left or right up to this point in the American experience in the war. You know, you were an American, you spoke like an American, and suddenly there was this hint, this whisper that maybe you couldn't trust that guy, and the reaction was very telling. It was paralyzing to the American forces, much more than I would have imagined, and I think even much more than the people who dreamed up this idea. The Hitler and Skorzeny had no idea that just the thought of this in the minds of the Allies would be as paralyzing as it was.
Yep. Of course, indeed, Hitler ended up with his own paranoia.
Well, you know, he was obviously mentally ill, and there were a lot of suggestions that he was strung out on drugs at the end of the war, that he was using amphetamines to kind of rally his flagging energies. And I mean, how can you characterize this man as anything other than utterly insane?
And wondering who was going to try to kill him next, probably.
Exactly. And but you know, he was also an undeniably kind of brilliant strategic mind, and this was his plan to kind of save himself and save what he thought he was doing for Germany. So. The great thing about interesting villains is they always have their reasons, and they think they're doing what is the right thing, and that's what's so terrible about them.
Well, you must have done a tremendous amount of research for this book, and you said a lot of it just became unclassified fairly recently?
Within the last 10 years, yeah. Most of the details about this operation was called Operation Greif, or Griffin, by the Germans, and it had been classified till about the mid-1990s. And as I said, the stuff about the railway battalions and those criminal prosecutions were likewise classified. So I feel it's the first time that this story's really been kind of brought to an audience, and I was happy to do it.
So did you or your assistant start pouring through all the documents, or how did you actually?
I was able to hire a couple of researchers who really knew the War College and the archives at the National Archives, and also the archives at the U.S. Military Intelligence, and that's where I drew a lot of this information from.
We'll be right back with Mark Frost. We are back with Mark Frost, author of The Second Objective. Well, you say you were raised in a military household, or your father was in the Navy.
Right.
And you grew up watching all kinds of war films and reading the books and all that?
Yeah, I think for my generation, World War II was the kind of big event looming over us from the recent past, and
doesn't get much bigger than that.
It doesn't, and you think about how pervasive it was in the culture, during the 50s and 60s, even into the 70s. We were still making, big movies about this and still kind of digesting the whole experience as a culture. So I felt it was a fascinating thing to go back and look at through a lens of the 21st century, and to see how these issues like terrorism and loyalty and maybe the war wasn't quite so black and white inside some individuals' minds as we were led to believe.
Well, on that point, you, toward the end of the book, tell what happened to Skorzeny as he manages to kind of slither away into off into the sunset or something. Yeah. But what did happen with him? And
well, Skorzeny's a fascinating case. He was arrested after Hitler was killed, and was literally considered the most dangerous man in Europe. And his capture was a cause for great celebration, and he was set to go on trial. And just prior to standing trial for alleged war crimes, he had a meeting with Wild Bill Donovan, a secret meeting, who at that point was the head of the OSS, and which later became the CIA. And shortly after that, Skorzeny disappeared from captivity. And it was later kind of hinted or revealed that he had made a secret deal with the CIA, or the forerunners of the CIA, to provide information for them about what was going on in Soviet Russia and the big threat coming from the communist nations.
Wow.
In exchange for his freedom.
So there you have the American CIA dealing with the Nazis
with one of the worst. I mean, who remained free for the next 30 years, founded what later became known as Odessa, the post-war fascist organization that many believe was the forerunner of modern terrorism. He moved to Argentina. He became a lover of Eva Perón's. He became a multimillionaire with his hands and all. I mean, he's like a James Bond villain. I mean, there's one of the most dastardly people who walked the planet during the 20th century, and died in bed in 1975 in Madrid. And there's footage of all these old Nazis at his funeral.
So he never served any jail time at all?
He was in captivity briefly awaiting trial. And
okay, except for
that.
He managed to, was it accurate in your book, the way he managed to, I don't want to give away too much, the way he managed to engineer?
Yes, all of that's absolutely true. And
wow.
He's worthy of a book all on his own. I mean, you can't make up villains as complex and interesting as this guy was. And we're good to be rid of him, I'll put it that way.
Well, when you were mentioning some of the kind of the lessons or what you learned from looking back at the World War II through today's eyes, I mean, any thoughts or what you learned or think people could learn or should learn from?
Well, there's lots of great quotes from great generals who said, we must never learn to love war. It can be a beautiful thing, but it is so utterly terrible. It's the worst of human nature. It brings out the worst in people. Our collective experience of remembering World War II is now that it was largely positively a good thing, and that it brought out the best American characteristics, and it brought America to the kind of forefront of kind of the global status that we sort of still enjoy today. But it also brought out a lot of barbarity in people, and it brought out a kind of savage quality in people that never recovered from it. And a lot of that was kind of swept under the carpet. And
so if you look in the kind of the closet or underneath the shiny veneer, there's really some kind of...
There were a lot of people who came back from that war who never recovered, and we didn't understand things like post-traumatic stress syndrome and the kind of mental illness that can result from the stresses that war puts on you. And there's some devastating stories about those things that happen to people. So it was just a way to look at the war and say, you know, it wasn't just all one rosy, happy picture.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. This is Mark Frost. The book is The Second Objective. Thanks, everybody, for watching. We'll see you next time.